Hello, it's good to see you again. I thought it would be fun if we talked about something that I'm very passionate about. And based on some of the things that I've done on this channel, some of y'all are pretty passionate about too, particularly Marvel. I'm a really big fan of Marvel, and I've been reading their comics since I was a very young child. And I wanted to share with you today a comic that was especially meaningful to me growing up. And that is the X-Men special graphic novel, God Loves, Man Kills. It's a very unusual comic, and it's not normal as far as X-Men comics go. When I was a young teenager, my older brother had a soccer tournament in San Antonio, Texas, and I went down with my friend to support our brothers. And on the way back, my friend begged his father to let them stop at a comic book store. And I went inside only to find this comic, this actual comic, sitting on the shelf. Now, I had been just starting to collect X-Men comics at that time, and I'd never seen anything like it. The artwork inside is very, very different than what they call the house style for Marvel. It's very illustrative. It's almost watercolor in some of the coloring. And the story is very iconic. And in fact, several elements of the X-Men movies that you may have seen are actually based on this comic. And we'll get to that in a moment. But let's go ahead and begin. We open not with the X-Men. By the way, this is written by Brent Eric Anderson, but also Chris Claremont. And Chris Claremont had one of the longest runs on writing a comic of just about anyone in the industry. And I certainly fell right in the middle of the Chris Claremont era. And this one starts out with his writing of two young African-American children, and they are running from unknown assailants. And we find out through their dialogue that their parents have been killed, and they are being hunted down by mercenary-looking figures, two men and one woman. And finally, the younger daughter, the younger sibling, trips and falls near a play swing. And the older brother asks them, what do you want? And the woman, who is clearly the leader, she says that they are purifiers. And by now, their intentions should be obvious. She holds out a gun to them. And we see, for the first time, that these two are not being persecuted because of the color of their skin, but because they are mutants. And the boy is killed. And just before he is killed, we see his eyes glowing, which lets us know that this is a mutant. And the little girl asks why. She's crying, of course. Her brother's just been killed in front of her. And the lead purifier says, because you have no right to live. And she kills the little girl. She then instructs her men to string up the children so that the other children will find them in the morning. And written on the swings that they have been chained to is mutie, which is the most derogatory term for mutants in this world. In fact, it's equivalent in this world to the N-word. And before dawn comes, though, we see an energy field surround that swing, and the children are laid down on a metal pyre of sorts that's been constructed out of the swing set, and this is made by none other than Magneto. Now, Magneto is wearing his normal Magneto outfit, which is purple, by the way, and has a huge crazy collar and a purple cape. I mean, he is rocking the non-primary colors, but the thing that's missing is his helmet, and it makes him look so more human. This is a Holocaust survivor, not a supervillain. And he's talking in that exact way, that this is not the first time that he's seen children murdered simply because of who they are. And he vows to make those responsible pay. Now we cut to a high-rise in New York City. It is the Stryker building, and it's a huge building, so clearly this organization is very wealthy, and we see the classic televangelist. Now remember, this was published in the mid-'80s, and so it would have been near the height of televangelists in America, so this was a wonderful segue from reality. And this gentleman looks exactly like you expect a televangelist to look. He's a slim, pseudo-handsome, white-haired, white man, and we see him reading from the Holy Bible. And he's talking about the famous quote of anyone who is worshiping others, that they shall be set with stones till they die. And we see that he's going to a conference with several of the higher-ups of the Stryker organization, which is his tele-evangelical organization. This is the Reverend Stryker. And they are getting a rundown of the X-Men. This is the X-Men as they were at this particular time. That includes Cyclops, who of course can fire optic beams from his eyes, Storm, who can control the weather, Wolverine with his adamantium claws, enhanced senses, and his healing factor, Colossus, who can turn into organic steel and has super strength and partial invulnerability, and Ariel, Shadowcat, as many people know her, or more commonly even now, Kitty Pryde. At one point was known as Ariel. She, of course, can phase through solid objects. Nightcrawler, who is incredible acrobat, can cling to walls and ceilings, and is, most importantly, a teleporter. And, of course, they are led by Professor Charles Xavier, a telepath. We don't know exactly how Stryker has gotten this information, but it is generally implied that he has some sort of contact with the government that has given him this information. In the past, in the very distant, like the early 60s X-Men comics, the X-Men actually worked directly with the government, so there's a little bit to that, but it ultimately doesn't matter. He's a bad guy. He's going after the X-Men. And that's exactly what he's saying, is that if all goes well, they will not be around much longer. We cut to a dance studio run by Stevie Hunter. Now, one of the really fun things about the X-Men is they have a lot of supporting cast members who are not mutants, are not superpowered, are not even hyper competent, like, super spies or something like that. They're just friends of the X-Men. And one of them is Stevie Hunter. She's actually a dance instructor, an African-American woman. You'll see why I say that in a moment. And she's the dance instructor of Kitty Pryde. At this time, Kitty Pryde is a young girl, perhaps 14 years old. And we see Kitty Pryde flying out of the front window in fight with a much bigger boy. Now, she has the upper hand on this boy, and she is yelling at him, "Take it back, take it back." Her friend, Illyana, who is the younger sister of Peter, that is Colossus, is trying to pull her off the boy, and Colossus, in fact, who is coming to pick them up, is running, and he's yelling, "Katya, what are you doing?" And this distracts her for a moment. She looks away only to be punched in the eye by this boy. And we see Kitty is infuriated. Illyana is having to pull her back to keep her from just wailing on this boy. And Peter is separating them both. And Peter doesn't understand why she's so angry, and she's saying, well, you didn't hear what he said. She's so angry, she's actually starting to phase. We see Ileana's fingers starting to go into her arm, and Ileana is telling her to calm down before somebody notices. And this boy is just saying that it's her fault. She started it. Stevie Hunter is coming out, and they're explaining themselves. And we find out that this boy, his parents, are huge fans of the Stryker crusade, whose central premise is that we need to rid the world of muties. And it was that phrase in particular that set off Kitty, which is quite understandable as she is a mutant. He is starting to go into the rhetoric of Stryker when Peter cuts him off simply by being Peter, even without turning into organic steel. Peter Rasputin is a monster of a man, and the boy quickly backs down, and he's doing the but he's thinking to himself and whispering to himself that maybe he'll get her later when this big brute of a Russian isn't around. And Stevie is pointing out the obvious, is that Kitty Pryde is an X-Men. Now, the X-Men train to use their powers, but they are essentially a paramilitary organization. They learn how to fight. They have to learn how to fight or they will die. And so Kitty has been highly trained by people like Wolverine, who are some of the most dangerous fighters in the world. Also, if you want to get very pedantic, Kitty Pryde also had a episode where she went and got some training with ninjas, but that was slightly after this, so we don't have to talk about that. And Stevie Hunter is saying, you could have killed him if you had persisted on like this. What happened? And when she talks again about him saying that they were horrible muties that needed to be killed, Stevie Hunter says, well, they're only words, child. To which Kitty replies, what if he said I was a lover? And yes, she uses the N-word. What if he said that? Would you be so tolerant then? And they go off, Kitty, Ileana, and Peter. And as they go off, Peter is telling Stevie, she did not mean it. It was not intended. And as they walk off, she's thinking to herself, no, she meant every word. And she was right. And we see that they are being surveillanced by a van that is none other than the Stryker mercenaries we saw from earlier. They are asking, should they take out Stevie Hunter? Just take one shot. Pew! But that is not their orders right now. Their orders right now are to observe for the ultimate plan. We cut back to Xavier's school for gifted youngsters, and Nightcrawler is coming in to see what's going on. Wolverine notices her shiner, as he puts it, and he asks her if it was from a accident or a scrape, and she admits that it was from a fight, and he wants to know why. I mean, how did this happen to her? And she's so angry that she can't even talk about it. And she says, I guess I just don't have your killer instincts. Everyone is gathering around the television in the main room because there is a debate on television. The debate is between Professor Charles Xavier and William Stryker, the Reverend William Stryker, on mutants. And what is happening is Charles Xavier is appealing to people's humanity, to their intellect, that well, intellectually, of course these people are human, and we can't treat them like animals. And Reverend Stryker is quoting fear-mongering, particularly from Senator Kelly, who, if you recall from the first X-Men movie, was the senator who was trying to make a bill to control mutants. And it finally ends, and they admit Stryker won. I mean, in the eyes of people, the fear that people had was so palpable that they would have definitely agreed with Stryker. And they realized that if this continues the way it is, people could be legally hunted and contained if they are mutants. After this very disappointing talk, they decide maybe we get off to work off some steam. Why don't we go to the danger room and hit some things? We see all of the various X-Men getting into their superhero costumes, all of them thinking thoughts about how could this be happening where humanity is turning so nastily on mutants. And we cut to Xavier, and we see that Scott Summers, that is Cyclops, and Aurora Monroe, that is Storm, have actually accompanied him. And they bump into a woman. We recognize this woman as the Purifier who murdered the two children at the beginning. We cut back to the danger room, and Illyana has programmed this danger room. It's a very straightforward premise where each X-Men has a task. There is a robot with missiles who is trying to destroy a family of mannequins. It is Kitty Pryde's job to keep the family safe. Colossus must also try to keep the family safe. Wolverine is trapped up in a cage. He has to get out of the cage without using his claws. Nightcrawler has to get a giant piece of machinery from one end of the danger room to the other. Now, Nightcrawler can teleport objects or people with him, but there's a limit to the size that he can do. The round begins, and the robot fires 2 missiles at the mannequins. Colossus can't stop them in time, but Kitty Pryde flies up. And one of the interesting elements of Kitty's power, when she phases, any electrical things she passes through short circuit. And so the 2 missiles short circuit, so it sends them out of control. Wolverine can't use his claws, so he's seeing if he can use his claw to just maybe pick the lock without actually cutting the bar. Maybe that won't count. Colossus is trying to fight the robot, while Nightcrawler is trying to teleport to the other side. We see him trying as hard as we can in a really fascinating art moment. We see him beginning to use his power, and we actually see the special effect of his BAMF on the other end of the room. Like he's activating his power, but he can't complete it. Finally, he teleports to the other end of the room, but he goes and falls. The agony was terrible. He was almost caught in between, which would have killed him, and he is unable to move the mass. That's when Kitty Pryde says, what happens if we change the rules? Kitty is phasing through the robot to short-circuit it, while Colossus blocks the missiles with his chest. He, of course, is almost invulnerable in his armored form. Nightcrawler teleports to Wolverine on top of the cage, and Wolverine realizes that he can't use his claws to cut the cage, but he can cut the chain that is attaching the cage to the ceiling, which causes them to fall on the target. But that mass is not heavy enough. Colossus throws the giant piece of machinery towards the target, and Nightcrawler uses his teleporting powers, grabs hold of Wolverine, and teleports them both to safety, which ends the program. This is a very common tactic in X-Men comics to have a Danger Room session, which is a great way to show how the different characters' powers work. We cut to the ABC studios, I like that, and Charles Xavier is often subtly and not so subtly referred to. He's very rich, and he has a Rolls Royce, and he and and Colossus and Storm are driving home when suddenly Xavier gets a sense that something is wrong. There's an attack. The vehicle is hit by some kind of weapon. It's so strong, it smashes the car off the road. It's burning. Colossus uses his optic powers to blast open a way out when we see a sniper. Just as Cyclops comes out, he is shot and falls. Aurora, who is pulling out Xavier, who is unconscious, is also shot. And then we see the car destroyed by a bazooka. The woman that we saw at the beginning says, "Perfect. Notify the Reverend. Mission accomplished." We cut back to Xavier's school and we see the printout reports. All of them did very well, but Wolverine got a 99, the highest score of all of them. And when Nightcrawler asks him why he did so well, he says, clean living, of course. And as they're talking about the scenario, Nightcrawler answers the phone. And his face goes pale. Well, as pale as a blue-skinned Nightcrawler can. And he turns to the others and he says, "There's been an accident. The Professor, Scott, and Aurora are dead." We cut to the lake next to Xavier's school for the gifted youngsters. It's the next day, and we see Kitty Pryde with her head in her knees. And Illyana, her best friend, comes to check on her. And Kitty is at first very obstinate toward her, very angry towards her, but Illyana knows that she's really just upset about the death of their friends. They hug and they cried, and what she's most furious about is, as horrible as all of this is that through all of the things the X-Men have been through, that for the three of them to die in a car accident is just almost unthinkable. And they're thinking about a quote that Colossus has said about measuring the greatest joys and the deepest depths. And that's when Illyana sort of nudges her that, "You like my brother, don't you?" And there's a little bit of talk about that. But then Illyana remembers why she asked Kitty to come over here is that she found something in the woods. It is a survey equipment. And the survey equipment is covered by camouflage, but she found it, and it is pointed at the mansion. Kitty says, "Well, why don't we find out who's behind it?" She phases into the ground and comes up through the device, which short circuits it, and she says, "Now all we have to do is wait for whoever it was to come and check out on the equipment." We cut to Central Park where the explosion happened, and we see Logan, who is, of course, Wolverine, looking over the blast. Now, of course, Wolverine has enhanced senses, and he's looking at the blast. He also used to be a secret agent, and he's also been an assassin. And he's telling Colossus that this is a setup. The reason he knows is that it has all the signs. It's perfect. Everything is burned. Everything is gone. There's one element missing, though. He can smell the bones from the accident that have been left, the little shards that even the police have not found, and they are not their friends. Sure enough, as he suspected, someone who actually pulled this off is watching them. Nightcrawler, who is very good at stealth with his teleportation and his indigo blue skin, is watching on a high above street lamp, and he sees the people who are watching them. He is in radio contact with Wolverine, and Wolverine says, "Let's nail the bastards." The surveying car suddenly has its binoculars obscured by a blue object, which is Nightcrawler hanging upside down on the car saying, "Boo." The people inside try to react by pulling their weapons. Wolverine is slashing through the door with his claws, pulling one man out and knocking him to the ground. The very competent woman that we saw before is stepping on the gas, and she's trying to drive away. Nightcrawler is still on top of the car and hanging on. As we said before, he can stick to objects, making it easy for him to hold on. The car is coming straight towards Colossus. And Colossus realizes if this car is trying to get away, it's about to go into heavy New York traffic. People could get hurt. He cannot allow that. He runs towards the car, and he is going to smash it with his armored form. That's not going to be great for anyone inside the car. Nightcrawler, even though they're trying to stop this people, he doesn't want the girl inside to die. He teleports inside the car, grabs hold of her, and teleports her away. wonderful art moment. You actually see the smoke from his teleportation trailing out behind the car as Colossus, in a series of movements, smashes the car so hard that it flips over his head and he is left holding the engine block. And he's saying to himself, either cars are getting less well made or I am getting stronger. And that's when Nightcrawler is calling to him that there were other people in the back seat of the car. These are people in power armor, what are often referred in the X-Men comics to mandroids, which I love that name. But these are gentlemen in power armor with shooty blasters on their arms, and they fire one at Colossus. He is nearly invulnerable, but he's not completely invulnerable, and this knocks him down. However, before they can do another thing, suddenly both of the men in power armor lift up into the air. All of their metal clothing fly off them, leaving them only in underwear. The cars as well just pulls apart into pieces and wraps them in metal cocoon. This, of course, is done by Magneto. Magneto, however, says, "Hold, X-Men. I come to you as a friend, and if you'll have me, an ally." We cut back to Kitty and Illyana. They've been waiting for quite a while when suddenly we see several of the mercenaries come to check on the equipment. Kitty decides to do something risky. She actually phases into the ground, and by swimming through the ground in her phase state, she's hoping to get behind the people to spy on them. The problem is, when they fix the device, it turns out one of the things the device does is identify mutants. It targets Illyana, who is a mutant. And before Kitty can come back up, Illyana is shot. Now, Kitty hears the gunshot. She sees Illyana. She's thinking, no. But the mercenaries say that she is unconscious, just like probably a few other X-Men who were shot earlier. These are tranquilizer guns. They put her in the car. Kitty is going to try to phase into the trunk so that she can follow them. However, inside the car, in almost a Batman 1966 way, there is an actual button for nerve gas into the trunk because, of course, if you're a supervillain, a hero might try to hide in your trunk. So, of course, you'd have an easily accessible switch that would fire nerve gas into your trunk. I love these little moments in comics. But that is going to knock out Kitty so that they can bring them both back to Stryker. We cut later to Xavier's estate, and we see the two captured purifiers. They are still in their metal cocoons. Wolverine puts his fist up to one of their necks, and he lets one claw come to the side, and he says, "That's one." He lets the other claw go to the next, and he says, "That's two." And he leans in and says, "Wanna go for three? Your funeral, bub." And Magneto says, "Logan, may I suggest an alternative?" To which Logan says, "Your lucky day, pal." And Magneto says, "I doubt that." Now, we don't actually know what Magneto does to these two men. We see the man twisting in agony, and we see metal rings around his fingers as if he might be on like a rack-like device controlled by Magneto. But what is obviously clear is these men are tortured, and they tell everything. And Nightcrawler is wondering that if they use the same methods as the villains, are they really any better? We cut to a strange red view of New York City, and on top of one of the highest buildings. Well, this is actually the World Trade Center, since this is well before 9/11. And we see Xavier being put on a cross and crucified by the X-Men. All of the X-Men look demonic. They look monstrous. And in each and every way, they are torturing him. We see Nightcrawler chewing on his neck like a vampire. We see Kitty phasing into his heart and pulling it out. We see Colossus punching him. We see Wolverine clawing him. We see Storm electrifying him. All of them. And finally ending with Cyclops, who is like his son. But instead of his optic blast, he fires like a black miasma. And in that miasma, we see the X-Men fighting each other and dying. And that, of course, is one of Xavier's greatest fears, is to see his X-Men die. When suddenly a bright light comes out of the heavens and destroys the demonic X-Men. And a figure comes out. This figure is William Stryker. He's holding out his hand to Xavier and saying, just take my hand and everything will be okay. Xavier wants to. But something in the back of his mind stops him and he falls back into the red abyss. We cut and see that Xavier is actually in a sensory deprivation tank where he's hooked up to all kinds of probes. They are psychically bombarding him. And we see that a scientist, who we know as Philip, is monitoring this progress. They are brainwashing him to make him obey the commands of the Stryker organization. They are making progress, but they still haven't quite broken him. Stryker is asking about the updated status. And what they are doing in addition to brainwashing him is we actually see 2 chairs that hold Cyclops and Storm, and they're being tortured as well. And their mental anguish is transmitted to the professor, which is doubly giving him pain. And now we get a flashback as to why Stryker does this, that he was a military man. And when he was working on the atomic bomb, they told him it was safe. But when his wife gave birth, it was actually during an accident on the road in the desert. And when she gave birth, he said that the child was a monster. Of course, we know that it's a mutant. He killed his wife. He killed the child. And then he hid his crime by burning them in the accident. He went after that way from bad to worse, from drinking to fighting to discharged. Things just kept getting worse and worse until he found religion. And he began to realize that the sin of this mutant wasn't his, but his wife's. That it was her fault, her sin that had caused this mutant, and that mutants were the true plague of humanity and must be destroyed. And that is what led to the Stryker movement that has gotten so big. And we see William Stryker back in reality, that he has gotten word that the 2 girls have been found, and they're asking what to do with them. And Stryker says, kill them. And Storm and Cyclops hear this, and she screams, no! As the suit lowers back down to torture her, we see out in the distance the suit is also clearly dampening her powers, but before it closes, we see a lightning strike on the Manhattan skyline. We cut to the car where they had knocked out Kitty, and they've put Muty on the back of the car, and then all of them have pulled out their guns and are going to fire into the trunk to riddle Kitty with bullets. But before they can check and see if she's dead, they realize she is gone. She has actually gone out, phased through the trunk. And the lead purifier has a mobile scanner that is scanning for Kitty, and they are going after her. Kitty is running through the very bad streets of Manhattan, and she's not doing well. She actually did get a half breath of the nerve gas, but she was able to phase out of the car enough to breathe outside the car, but she's still not at her best. And as has been shown in the comic, when she's not doing her best, she can't phase very well. She runs into a highly ethnic group of gang members. She was hoping for some kind of rescue, but this is clearly not what these people will do. However, the Purifier, this is the same woman from the beginning, says, "Back off, guys. She's mine." Now, these guys don't appreciate a white woman coming onto their territory with a gun, and so they try to draw on her. One of them throws a knife. Now, she is able to kill all of these gang members because she's an incredibly dangerous individual, and maybe for other reasons that we'll find out later. But in the confusion, Kitty is able to phase through a wall before this woman can shoot her. Now, the knife did strike her in the shoulder, but she's shrugging it off and telling the rest of the Purifiers to find Kitty Pryde. We see Kitty phasing through a wall. She finds a payphone. Again, this is the 80s. Those things still existed. And she phases into her hand, into the payphone, and pulls out quarters. A very cool trick, by the way. She's saying that she will pay back Ma Bell later, but this is an emergency. She calls the mansion, and we see that Nightcrawler answers. And she says, "Fuzzy Elf," that's her nickname for him, "I'm on this street. I'm in the Bronx. I'm in trouble." When suddenly the payphone explodes. This was clearly done by one of the Purifiers. She is phased just in time, but she's caught a mouthful of smoke. They're trying to shoot at her, but the bullets are phasing through her. She's beginning to walk up into the air. One of the things Kitty can do is she can actually phase up through the air and walk on air molecules. She can't really fly, but it's kind of a continuous float. And she's able to float up enough to phase into the L train, the elevated train, and make her way in. Now, people are freaked out that this young girl is just phased in, but a police officer who didn't see it happen comes in and is asking if she's okay. And she's telling him that people are trying to kill him, people are trying to kill her. And when he's trying to calm her down, suddenly the top of the L train smashes open and Kitty sees the police officer shot. This is done by the Purifiers. Kitty is trying to protect the police officer. And the Purifier is saying, well, this is even better. We'll kill you and we'll kill the police officer, and people will blame the mutants for this police officer's death. When suddenly the L train lifts up into the air. Who can lift metal? Of course, it's Magneto. Magneto is terribly amused by their attempts to shoot him simply by holding out his hands. The various bullets fly away from him, and we see in a wonderful section of panels Colossus crushing one of the guns with his hands, Wolverine slashing one of the guns to pieces, Nightcrawler's tail grabbing one of the guns and pulling it out of their hand. And we see the rest of them being taken down one by one by the X-Men. Kitty is a little freaked out because Magneto is supposed to be the bad guy. She didn't get the memo about him teaming up. But Magneto is saying to calm yourself, child. And he holds out a hand, and the steel jacket of the bullet comes out of the police officer, which is helpful, but he was still shot. He needs medical attention. And Magneto is made part of the smashed L train into kind of a magic carpet. And he and the X-Men are flying the police officer to a hospital. The police officer is asking what's going on, and Magneto is saying, for that, you can thank Reverend William Stryker. Speaking of which, we see Stryker, and he has finally gotten through to Xavier. We see Xavier finally accepting him as his master. The brainwashing is complete, and Stryker demands proof of his loyalty. He demands that he kills Cyclops and Storm. And he does. He uses his mental powers and he smashes them with his psychic blast. And we see both Cyclops and Storm dead with blood running from their nose. And they say that their negative vital signs, the mutants, are dead. We cut to Philip, that was the scientist who was brainwashing Xavier, and he is driving off in a limo with a driver driving him off. And as they're doing so, suddenly Ariel, that is Kitty Pryde, comes through the ceiling, phasing through the ceiling, grabs him by the mouth before he can say anything, and phases him through the ground into the street. Not into the street, but onto the street. And we see Nightcrawler thinking to himself how dangerous that was. She had to time that phase perfectly. If she had phased her body at the wrong moment, she would have phased into the car and died horribly. And how brave this young girl is. Nightcrawler decides to take advantage, as he often does not, of his monstrous form. He looks very similar to a classic devil. He grabs hold of Philip, wraps him around the neck with his tail, and pulls him up onto the wall. And Philip is saying that, of course, he'll never talk. And Nightcrawler, acting almost like a vampire, is extending out his fanged teeth and saying, "I was hoping you would say that. We have many, many ways of making you talk, but many more ways of making you die." And unsurprisingly, Philip decides to talk. We cut to the Stryker building, and we see the two purifiers who are throwing the bodies of Cyclops and Storm to go to the incinerator. The woman who we've seen throughout this story, the main purifier, has decided to ride along with them. Indeed, this is also has Illyana coming with them. She is not dead yet, but she is going to be killed and put in the incinerator as well. They hit the B button for the basement, but the elevator starts to go up and up and up, almost as if some kind of magnetic force was pulling it up. Annie, by the way, is the name we finally learned of this purifier, tries to pull her gun, but it sticks to the side of the wall. She just barely is able to pull open the door, nearly superhuman strength, which is interesting. And as the elevator smashes through the roof like Willy Wonka's glass elevator, she leaps out, trying not to think that if she misses, she will fall down the side of the skyscraper. She just manages to catch the side of it as Magneto takes away the elevator. Very easily elsewhere, the X-Men are able to subdue the guards, but what they find is Illyana, who is thankfully all right, but the dead bodies of Cyclops and Storm. They are, of course, horrified, but Wolverine informs them they aren't dead. He can smell it. The machines surely said they were dead, but he can tell that they are still alive. And Magneto and the others are hypothesizing that Xavier, on some level, cannot kill his X-Men, who are like his children. And Magneto creates a electromagnetic shock, a gentle one, that actually revives them both. And now they are having a X-Men off, and that's where Magneto and the X-Men try to decide what to do next. Do they attack? Do they confront? Do they run? What do they do at this point? And what they decide to do is to stop his plan, to stop William Stryker, but also to reveal him to be the murderer that he truly is. And we see that there's going to be a massive assembly at a huge covered stadium. And inside, we see Xavier being hooked up to machinery. What this machinery is going to do is let Xavier kill every mutant in the world. Now, if you remember X-Men 2, this was the basic plot of the ending, and it was taken directly from this comic. As Stryker is getting ready to go on, Annie, who is the purifier who leapt away from the elevator, warns that the X-Men may be coming, but he will not stop. He's giving a huge talk in front of these thousands of adoring fans. And he is saying that, are these people natural? Are these mutants human? Never. They are not as God made them, but they are creatures of hell. We see the X-Men who are making their way to the center when suddenly their heads begin to ache. They are beginning to bleed from the nose and the ear. Xavier is slowly killing every mutant nearby, and we see a few people randomly, just average folks, fall to the ground in agony. This is not an immediate process, but it will eventually kill them all. Magneto takes a more direct approach. He actually lifts up the roof of the stadium to make his entrance. By the way, he's got his full helmet on now, which has horns. William Stryker takes this to advantage by quoting the Bible about the horned devil, and he points at Magneto. This has been timed so that Xavier hits him with a psychic blast, which knocks Magneto into the middle of the crowd. Now, he is able to push back the crowd with an electromagnetic force, but he's very weak because this psychic blast was so strong that if he was a weaker person, he would have been instantly killed. One of the senators, who actually is a supporter of the Reverend Stryker, is beginning to bleed from the ears. One of the things that isn't talked about a lot in the X-Men universe is that a lot of mutants are very minor mutants. They can't control the weather. They can't teleport. They just have innate mutant abilities that are so subtle that unless they were tested, you would never know. That is exactly what's happening to the senator. And he is saying that this is a madman. He's killing me. Inside, we see the X-Men making their way through, but as they try to get close to the professor, he is mind blasting them backwards. Now, the X-Men are able to take out most of the purifiers, but the problem is they're literally dying on their feet. These people who they would easily be able to defeat, they're just able to barely hang on to their own. Annie is coming to help and make sure that the Reverend is okay. When she falls, her nose begins to bleed. Do you remember all of those incredible acrobatics and feats of strength? It seems that Annie had the basic Steve Rogers power of stronger, faster, tougher. She is a mutant. His biggest supporter is a mutant and didn't even know it. And when she comes to Stryker for support, saying, please, I am your most trusted servant, he pushes her away so hard off the podium that she falls. And the cameraman catches her falling to the ground, breaking her neck and dying. Stryker has just murdered a woman on camera. And Magneto is saying, hey, everybody, is this the kind of person that you want to follow? 2 police officers are actually defending Magneto. And the crowd is saying, wait, we need to kill this guy. He's an evil mutant. And they're saying, guys, that guy up there is the one who's killing people. In the back, they have a plan. They can't attack Xavier directly, because if they try, he simply mind blasts them. So at the same time, Cyclops leans over and fires a blast seemingly at nowhere. Meanwhile, Nightcrawler teleports Wolverine behind the professor. Wolverine must intend to kill the professor with his claws, because that is the immediate threat. Xavier senses that threat and blasts Wolverine with his mental blast. However, Cyclops' beam, which can bounce off walls, bounces, and clips Xavier across the face, knocking him unconscious. Wolverine is saying, that was a really good plan, but your beam knocked him unconscious. My claws would have killed him. To which Cyclops simply responds, I know. And he destroys the machinery that was being used to amplify the Xavier's powers, stopping the death of all of these mutants. But what they decide is that this is time to confront the Reverend. And they walk out onto stage in their superhero costumes. And Cyclops begins to debate Stryker, much like Xavier, but with much more passion. And what he's saying is, what makes your connection to heaven greater than mine? Does an athlete, is he not human because he's stronger than an average human? Is any other skills as a painter or an artist, does that make it different than my ability to shoot beams from my eye? And he's saying, for all we know, we could be the true human race and you be the mutants. And Reverend Stryker, who is now losing it, points to Nightcrawler, the classic visage of a devil, and says, human, you dare call that human? And that's when Kitty Pryde, a young teenage girl, stands up to him and says, more human than you. Nightcrawler's generous and kind and decent. He has every reason to be bitter, every reason to become as much of a demon inside as out, but he decided to laugh instead. I hope I can be half the person he is, and if I have to choose between caring for my friend and believing in your God, then I choose my friend. And Stryker, picking up the dropped gun from Annie, who he just murdered, says, girl, let those words be your epitaph. And he's going to shoot Kitty Pryde. Now, we know that Kitty can phase, but the fact is he's pointing a gun at a teenage girl in the middle of an assembly, and we hear the gun fire. But what we realize, it wasn't Stryker who fired. It was a police officer, one of the police officers who was defending Magneto. And the crowd is saying, that guy shot Reverend. And the other police officers, yeah, the guy who was about to shoot a teenage girl? Yeah, if that's a Reverend, things have changed a lot since I was in Sunday school. And we cut a few days later to Xavier's school. We see Magneto and the X-Men watching TV. Already they're saying that Stryker was wrong, but that maybe some of his ideas were right, that maybe he was just radical, but that some of his ideas were okay. And Xavier is so beaten down by this. He's saying, my X-Men, if you want me to join Magneto, I will. If we want to take the path of power, because Magneto wants to dominate humans to save mutants, whereas Xavier's dream is that mutants and humans will work together in harmony. And it's actually Cyclops who tells him that, no, Professor, we believe in your dream. And so he rejects Magneto, and Magneto leaves saying that the next time we meet, it will be as enemies. And we see the X-Men having a tender moment, and particularly Cyclops and Storm going out onto the veranda, not as a romantic couple, but as long time friends. And she gives him a gentle kiss and she holds his hands. And Cyclops says, we care about each other. And she says, and from caring comes love. And he says, which makes the world go round. And Storm has the final lines, which is, if only that were so. And that is the end of God Loves, Man Kills by Chris Claremont, which is one of the finest X-Men comics. I highly recommend you check it out. Go to Amazon to find it, or if you have the Marvel Unlimited the Marvel Unlimited app to read it. It's a wonderful read. You guys take care and make mine Marvel.